Last week, MedStar Health, which operates 10 hospitals and more than 250 outpatient medical centers in the Washington region, suffered a ransomware attack. It disrupted their operations and put them front and center in the fight against cybercrime. On Friday, we spoke with Dan Holden, director of ASERT, which is Arbor Network Security Engineering and Response Team. We chatted about how healthcare organizations are being impacted by ransomware, where that threat is headed, and how organizations can keep themselves safe. The big story this week that everyone's talking about is this MedStar Health ransomware attack and all the different problems that this provider has faced because of it. And apparently the hackers are demanding around 45 bitcoins, which is around $19,000 for the decryption key. And this story stood out to me because 2 months ago now, back in February, when it was the Hollywood Presbyterian Medical Center, they paid $17,000 to get in a decryption key after a ransomware attack. And I remember thinking at the time, like, wow, I wonder if this is going to set a precedent and we're going to see a lot more of these attacks. And then the last month or two, we've really seen a lot of it. Just wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, the price point is actually, I would say, on average, for what we've seen with not only ransomware attacks over the years, but also DDoS extortion attacks as well. Just the threatening of taking down your website because it's your primary revenue generator. So it seems to be a price point that attackers have been using for some time. And I guess maybe the reasoning is that regardless of the vertical that they're going after, they have found that this is an amount that is not, particularly upsetting, regardless of what the entity is or the vertical is. They've probably figured out over time that the ROI on this particular dollar amount is fairly good. And if they go too high, then the ROI starts to change, and maybe they don't get the payout as often as they would like. So that, or like I said, they've just been kind of using that. I'd say over the years we've seen lots of between 15,000 and 20,000 US as a ask, and maybe it's just kind of the tried and true amount. And like I said, they just know that more often than not they'll get it, and that's cybercrime, as cybercrime has been for a long time now. Is it's all about the ROI on their side. So tracking the success of these campaigns is a big deal, regardless of what the campaign type is.
I wanted to ask you about people paying these ransoms, because I saw an article this morning. A couple months back, someone at the FBI had basically said, hey, sometimes best option is to pay. And apparently that didn't make some members of Congress too happy, because they're basically saying the FBI is endorsing paying cyber criminals. And so now they're kind of backtracking on that. So just,
it's like the old government saying of, we won't negotiate with terrorists. And then all of a sudden it kind of feels like, I would say it's kind of situational. And I hate to say that. In the case of DDoS extortion, we generally advise not to pay. Now, it all comes down to, your own revenue. So I've certainly heard stories of gambling sites, for instance, that have paid extortion for, almost a year long. And it was simply because, paying the extortion was cheaper than preventing a possible attack. And then at some point, they raised the rent, so to speak, and all of a sudden the organization's tolerance changes. And so that's going back to the price point. That's probably why that is. But in these ransomware cases, it's tougher. It really is, because we're certainly at a point in time where any of these companies can communicate with their customers very easily, right? I mean, almost any company will communicate things via Twitter these days. And I think as consumers, we've all experienced some nastiness on the internet. I mean, most people have at least had some issue with malware at some point. We've all been reissued credit cards, who knows how many times at this point, not to mention personal data, notifications, and that sort of thing. So I think as just everyday citizens and consumers and customers of a lot of these companies, there's a certain aspect of when they come out and say, our site or our service is down due to DDoS, or We're unable to provide services at this time, or things are slower because, the network is down because ransomware or whatever. We feel bad for them, I guess is my point. So, they can communicate, and there's this, it's a whole lot better than saying, oh, we messed something up. Or there's a failure with our business or us, right? It's an external entity coming after them. But the issue with ransomware is, of course, now you're talking about not availability, you're talking about the data, and it is so critical, especially to these recent attacks, these hospitals. I mean, they can't do anything without patient data or without documentation. And it's just, in some cases, you have to pay it because you simply are not able to recover any other way. If you didn't have proper backups, or with, some of the latest malware, the malware going after the backups, it just puts them in an impossible situation in some cases. I think that's why we've actually seen some of these entities saying, not only are they paying, but they're saying they did pay because they simply had to. And there's no other way out at that particular point in time. And I think what we will end up seeing, probably this year, it's going to be pretty bad. The hospitals are not in a situation like, the financials would be, where they can find budget generally pretty easy for some catastrophe like this, and they've got staff and expertise. There's a big, big difference between a Fortune 100 company and everyone else, and their ability to defend themselves and respond. And that's certainly the situation these hospitals are in, and it's going to take some time for them to properly defend and be able to respond to these things. But certainly we are seeing that the attackers are very happy with their ROI on ransomware right now, and I would fully expect they're going to continue their investment, and the malware is going to keep getting better throughout this year, and they'll continue to find success and get paid.
And you brought up DDoS extortion and DDoS attacks, and that's kind of what stood out to me when I was reading this Washington Post article about the MedStar Health ransomware, is they were quoting different nurses and doctors, basically saying that it's really causing problems, and they had to turn away some patients just because they had to use paper records, and so it really seemed like it was impacting business operations. So to me, it seems kind of almost like two sides of the same coin. I don't know if you agree with that.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, to some extent, it's extortion, regardless of what type it is. It's a question of how damaging that particular extortion threat is. And like I said, sometimes the DDoS, you really don't know whether, they actually have the capability to take you down. Whereas ransomware, you're infected. It's popping up and it's telling you. So there's certainly a difference in terms of how bad is it? And, even if they are going to DDoS you, how long are they willing and able to do that for? And then how impactful to your revenue is that? So it's not that one is worse than the other. It's just a question of how bad can a particular attack be to a particular organization. What I would say is that, we've certainly seen these types of things before with other verticals as well. Before this, retail probably being the greatest example. Obviously, if you're a retailer, so much of our consumerism at this point is done online. You even order your pizza online, right? So if someone DDoSes the pizza delivery place, all of a sudden their revenue is insanely impacted, especially on, say, a Friday night or something. So it all comes down to how impactful it is to a particular organization. And with hospitals, obviously, they cannot operate, without the data and all the things they have to document and have access to. But it was the same thing also with what we saw, several years ago with so many of the point-of-sale attacks. Rather than going after you and I as the credit card holders, they just cut us out and went right to the people that were accepting all the credit cards. And so same sort of scenario where you see them being attacked at multiple levels. You can go after their website, or you can go right after the cash registers. And again, retailers can be in a tough spot, right? I mean, some of these retailers are operating with thin margins. As we all know, there's a reason why it's called Black Friday. A lot of them are not very profitable until the holiday season. So, it's not like they are defended as well as, say, a government entity or a financial entity either. And so I think what we're seeing is attackers chasing these the soft underbelly, if you will, of the various verticals and these companies that are not in a position to be able to defend themselves as well. And it's a bit of a maturity curve, and it takes several years, generally, let's just say about 3 years or so, for a lot of these companies to figure out what is happening, get the budget, get the people, get things sorted. And, just like I think we saw that with retail, that's pretty much what we're seeing with hospitals now. Now, I will say there's a very interesting difference, though, between, let's say, the financial vertical, the retail vertical, and the hospitals. A lot of times with financial or retail, attackers are very interested in targeting countries that are financially successful. So big Western countries like the U.S., Canada, UK, Germany, France, right? Those are generally the countries that are going to be targeted. The interesting thing about hospitals is that is a vertical that doesn't particularly matter so much how successful, financially successful a particular country is. And that's what I found interesting about some of the latest malware. They're going after hospitals in countries like, Croatia. And that is not a country you hear about being targeted very often. If somebody says, oh, Japan was targeted, sure, that makes perfect sense. That's one of the largest GDPs in Asia. Okay, I get that. But Croatia, that probably wouldn't be at the top of our list. And that I would have to say is probably one of the most interesting things about the hospitals being attacked, just from a high-level thematic standpoint. That's a bit different than what we've seen in the past with something like a retail or a financial, or even government for that matter.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about criminals attacking hospitals, because I started interviewing people about cybercrime topics, I don't know, probably about 3 years ago now. And when I first started interviewing everyone, whenever it came to critical infrastructure and things like hospitals, people would acknowledge that, yeah, you can hack a pacemaker and you can hack hospital equipment, but no one really wants to hurt anyone. And I was at a talk just yesterday, and an FBI agent was talking about, he brought up ISIS and was talking about them possibly attacking, hospital critical infrastructure and taking down like a unit for premature babies and causing problems with that. And then this ransomware, it's not quite, the same level of threat, but in that Washington Post article that I read, they were talking about how it is a patient safety issue, and a nurse gave an example of putting someone on a powerful antibiotic for longer than she should have because the lab results were behind because of this ransomware attack. So just wanting your thoughts on that. Do you think that there is a shift towards these groups maybe not caring as much about sort of the ethical side of things, or?
Well, there's the old saying is you can't trust a thief. So anytime you're discussing ethics and crime, it's either difficult or kind of no-brainer. So I don't think human life is a part of the equation in this case, and that's probably why, to your point, it's not like we're seeing, 0 day on medical equipment. What we're seeing is a very simple extortion attack that is not, most of us would not judge that as all that impactful. In other words, if you or I had to go to the hospital right now, we'd be like, what's the big deal? Pay the $17,000 and, get me healthy. And I think that's the likelihood of that occurring is just so much higher. And the ROI is so much better than going after, something else. Yeah, I don't think, that's the thing is, going after I think it's anytime you start talking about the really cool 0 day or possibilities in any of these more real world systems, some call it stunt hacking. I don't personally feel that way. I think it's showing I think if you come from the old, hacker culture, the hacking culture was all about learning things in any system. It wasn't about just computers. So much of it had to do with phones. So I think it's very natural that we are seeing so much interest in cars or medical equipment or anything else that's technology. IoT, I think, is a great example. If a few years from now, we have to worry about our fridges and toasters, well, yeah, I can believe that, and I can also believe that we should be worrying about what comes with that. So, and of course, then there's also the philosophical discussions of, are we building Skynet? But I think it's a very natural progression. But I don't think, do I expect are cyber criminals ever going to be chasing those really bad things, those really nasty type of attacks? No. 0 day is not necessary for cybercrime. Going after people at that level is not necessary for cybercrime to be successful. I think it's more interesting from more of a James Bond, type of plot. It's interesting from those standpoints. It's interesting from sometimes what would be the art of the possible, if there really was, if cyber war was really more of a mainstay of modern warfare, if things were truly going to get nasty. Those are where those sorts of things come into play, I think. Mm-hmm. But is related to cybercrime? Yeah, not so much.
Yeah, so I guess I'm wondering if you anticipated these hospitals getting attacked in this way, or if there's anything that really stands out to you about that. Just wondering kind of like high-level trends, what are we learning? I guess I'm wondering if you think it's going to shift to another sector, or if you think all sectors should be very concerned about this threat.
It's always, predictions are both fun and near impossible, but I wouldn't say anyone's particularly surprised. And certainly we've seen ransomware now for years and years, but I would also tell you, we certainly saw ransomware malware start to increase mid last year. I think around July it started to increase. And then, the beginning of this year just started to raise considerably. So certainly the trend for the first part of this year is definitely ransomware, definitely extortion-based attacks. And, I don't think it's going to surprise anybody if the first half of the year is like that, and even possibly the whole year. Like I said, I think the real takeaway here is that, yes, it is a bit cyclical, I think, in terms of, like I said, we saw these sorts of attacks really focus on the retailers over the last, few years. And those targets are probably a bit better prepared than they were. I think, the natural progression in something like this is it starts to change geography. So, we've seen lots of stories of hospitals in the U.S., but now we're starting to see reports from other parts of the world. So I think that's a very natural progression. Like I said, I think you could probably count on these sorts of attacks being successful for generally at least a 3-year period, just because it's slow going. There's so many entities that that's the way security goes. Nobody wants to do anything until it happens to them. It's a bit like the insurance business in that case, because you don't scratch until it itches because you got bit, and nobody really thinks about the prevention until it's too late. So I think the question is, what would be the next vertical if we're chatting 3 years from now, 5 years from now? It's a very good question. Like I said, hospitals are rather interesting because it's a little bit more. It can be more diverse in terms of the geography. Maybe you ask for less money. Maybe they're asking for less money out of the hospitals in say, Croatia or Romania than they are out of the U.S., just so that they can, ensure a decent ROI. But, I think so many people in the security industry would say, in terms of soft underbelly, oil, gas, and the utilities, I think, you mentioned that earlier, is I think we're all fairly convinced that they're not in very good shape. But from a cyber criminal standpoint, you also have to ask yourself, well, how good a target are those from a financial standpoint for cybercrime? So I think, that discussion again goes back to what would be the point of the attack, and are we more frightened of that particular vertical because we know from more of a pure malicious standpoint, going back to your question about, is there a question of, the human life versus the money? Do they care? Exactly, how maniacal are these attackers? And no, I think cybercrime is really, it's just business. I think it's really just business for most of these people. And it's all just about the dollars and cents. The moment you get into cyber terrorism or the possibility of cyber war, I think most of us would be far more scared of the issues with the utilities, oil, gas, power, water, all those sorts of things. The things that we really rely upon every day as citizens, that stuff starts to get scary. But, from a cybercrime standpoint, I don't have any great prediction as to what's next, but certainly it is, I think, a bit cyclical in terms of the verticals, and they'll just move on to the next easiest target and look for the best ROI and measure that ROI. And measuring that ROI leads them to start to abandon one vertical and go to another.
Yeah, then my final question is, I always like to ask everyone, what should these different organizations be doing? Obviously, you're saying it's going to be a threat for the coming years. It seems with ransomware, the obvious thing is just to have a backup so that you can restore it. I mean, is there anything else that businesses should be doing precaution-wise?
Yeah, it's probably a tiered approach. Yeah, you nailed it. I think there's a lot of investment in not only making sure their backup processes are good, but also trying to protect those backup systems and processes from the advancements that are being made in the malware. So the attackers are well aware that really the only way out for the victim is backing up. So now the malware, of course, is looking for the backups and going after those systems, and the attackers are trying to identify those early so that is not an option. So even if you are backing up, you've got to make sure that you've got a system that is not going to fall to a campaign that is becoming more and more sophisticated to account for that. I think the first thing to do, honestly, is probably education, because that's probably the best ROI for the hospitals. Making sure that folks don't click on things they're not supposed to is probably the best, short-term ROI they can get. Longer term, they're going to have to do the same things everyone else has done, and that means there's going to have to be education, and the folks that dictate the budget are going to have to start to think about these sorts of threats and make sure that there's the people and the technologies made available to defend. And then I think especially what we've seen in so many other verticals and just over the years in cybersecurity in general is it's not just about having a detection capability, it's also about having response capabilities. And in the case of ransomware, that's what it's all about. Detecting doesn't get you anything. You either have to prevent or you have to respond. The moment you've detected it, it's already too late. So you've got to decide on what kind of strategy you're going to have specific to, I think, the ransomware threat. And that's why perhaps it's so interesting right now, because we've spent so many years talking about other types of threats like APT, for example. If this was an intellectual property theft, that's a completely different risk to an organization than something like ransomware. And so the defense and the response has got to be different as well. With APT, detecting is fine and responding is very important. With ransomware, like I said, detection's a little too late. So you either have to prevent or you've got to be able to respond properly. And so the investment model is potentially a little bit different there.
And that'll do it for this week's Cyber Chat podcast. Big thanks to Arbor Network's Dan Holden for stopping by to fill us in on the healthcare sector and ransomware attacks. As always, the Cyber Chat podcast is brought to you by Surfwatch Labs. Surfwatch Labs delivers cyber risk intelligence solutions that help organizations understand the potential for cyber attacks, determine the impact of their business, and proactively address threats head-on. For a weekly recap of important cybercrime news, check out Surfwatch Labs' other podcast, the Surfwatch Cyber Risk Roundup. And for more information on cyber risk intelligence, check out surfwatchlabs.com.